Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And this week, we're talking about Ukraine and Russia and energy politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back my friend John Harpole. He's the president of Mercator Energy. John, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Robert, great to be here.
Now, you've been on the podcast, so you know guests introduce themselves. Go.
42 years ago, I graduated from the University of Colorado and started in the oil and gas business. About a year and a half after that, I found myself working for an oil and gas company that was owned by General Electric. And when natural gas was deregulated in the late 80s, I was put in charge with two other folks in supplying natural gas to all the GE industrial plants in the U.S., essentially when natural gas was deregulated. 30 years ago, I started my own gas brokerage company. And we manage about 2.5 billion cubic feet of gas per day. The U.S. produces about 92 BCF a day. So amongst the five of us, we've got a pretty good handle on a good volume, ranging from clients that turn natural gas into ammonia down on the Louisiana coast to producers throughout the Rockies, the Midwest, producers in California, and industrial plants located all throughout the Midwest. So we get a really great picture of what's going on in the business. In the past, I worked on a liquefied natural gas import facility on the West Coast, and I've also managed to get a gas storage field certificated through the federal agency that allows you to construct those type of facilities. So I've really had a broad-reaching exposure to this natural gas world. The one other piece, I actually taught on two different occasions, courses in China to employees of PetroChina and members of the Central Party. I taught courses on how natural gas works in the U.S. So I've had some international exposure as well.
Well, that's what we want to talk about today is what's going on internationally. Where are gas prices? I was looking at the prompt on the Dutch TTF this morning, and we're recording on March 4th. It was at $52 on the front month for April delivery, and I think the Henry Hub price was about 1/10 of that. What's happening with gas prices in Europe, and where are they going?
Well, this is an issue that I've been following for about 20 years. When I started working on that, what was then going to be an import project into the United States, Robert, back in 2003 and 4, we thought that by this time the U.S. would be importing, based on demand projections and production projections at that time, we thought the U.S. would be importing anywhere from 25 to 40% of its natural gas. And with Russia being Russia owning the largest reserves of natural gas, we anticipated that we'd be buying a lot of natural gas from Russia. And so it was really one of those that piqued my interest in the sense that how reliable a supplier is this particular country. And so we literally started looking into it as a potential supplier to the facility that we were working on the West Coast. And I did my research and discovered that between the fall of the Soviet Empire, between 1991, let's say, and 2005, Russia had interrupted natural gas supplies to Europe on 55 different occasions. They negotiated their contracts with all the European utilities to expire in the middle of the winter. Think about it this way: the fall of the Soviet Union, the pipelines that moved natural gas from Russia proper through the Soviet Union to Europe all flow through the very countries that left the Soviet Union, and many of those joined NATO. And so it was clear to me back then that this was going to be an interesting play to see how this plays out. And it was obvious back 20 years ago that Putin would use that natural gas supply as a weapon of influence on Europe. What blows me away is how they fell into that trap that was set really literally 20 years ago. You know, you and I have talked about it. Three big issues. The EU relied too much on renewable energy, too little on hydrocarbons, and they've retired their nuclear plants and coal plants too early. And so it was a perfect storm for Putin. In a sense, we know that there are only three ways you can get gas into Europe. One is for it to be homegrown. 2 is for it to be imported by pipeline from Russia. And 3 is from waterborne transport through liquefied natural gas tankers. The reality right now is that if Russia cut off their natural gas supply entirely to Europe, there's not enough homegrown production in Europe, nor is there enough capacity to receive international gas brought in by boat. And so he has them, again, in this trap that, again, I believe he's been setting for 20 years. One other point to that, everybody talks about the SWIFT payments being canceled. Well, 2 banks do not fall into that category, and those are the banks that effectuate the transaction between the European utilities and the Russian supply of natural gas. So to cut those off right now would be cutting off their own foot.
So I wanted to, that was one of the first questions I had for you, was the Russia being banned from SWIFT, which is the kind of the international umbrella for these wire transfers of payments via international banks. But I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, that in that these sanctions, in fact, there was a carve out that still allows Gazprom and other Russian companies to get paid for delivering oil and gas into the European market or any other market in the world. Is that right?
That's correct. And it's stunning to me that hasn't gotten more attention, but there are 2 banks, Russian banks, that are involved in the majority of those transactions, and they have not been carved out from the SWIFT response by the rest of the world. They don't want to give Russia any excuse not to deliver that natural gas. You know, we're talking here today on March 4th. Last night, we saw a nuclear plant acquired by Russia. Well, that's the largest nuclear plant in Europe, not just Ukraine, but in Europe, and it supplies 25% of the electricity.
And this is Zaporizhzhia is, I believe, the pronunciation, but it's it's a very large plant. Again, nuclear gas, whatever, it's 5.7 gigawatts. This is a very, very large power plant.
I heard that it was 6 to 8 times larger than Chernobyl. But my over and under bet right now is how much longer will the 3 pipelines that are supplying natural gas that flow through Ukraine, how much longer will those operate? And then how much longer is it before that nuclear plant is turned off? Which would
then require yet more gas to keep the lights on in Ukraine. And I want to talk about Poland and coal in just a minute, but highlight that for me if you don't mind. Go back to that Ukraine and the 3 pipelines. Tell me. So there are 3 pipelines that Gazprom uses to transit gas into Europe, and they go through Ukraine.
There are actually 8 different delivery points that Russia utilizes to get gas into Europe. 3 of the pipelines, what I would call an interstate pipeline, or 3 of the pipelines that flow gas out of those 8 different delivery points, actually transit portions of Ukraine. And so I'm really concerned. I think if I'm the Russians, I go send the Chechens after those pipelines, blow them up, and blame it on the Ukrainians to make them the reason why people in Western Europe and Southern Europe are not getting natural gas. And I honestly,
so you're thinking or that they'll sabotage them somehow to make Europe suffer even more then?
Absolutely.
But would Putin do that sooner, or would he, if he starts to lose or things get bogged down, that he would, but would he do that? And also, wouldn't that then hurt his own interests? Because of another guest on the podcast, Benny Pizer, said the Europeans are paying something on the order of 700 million euros a day to Russia. That's helping Russia pay for the war. Well,
I think this will happen at the later stages of the capture of the total Ukraine. I think this will happen when they're pushing towards the west. You're from Texas. The distance between Kyiv and the further western portions of Ukraine is the distance between Dallas and El Paso. I mean, it's a good long march. And so I think this type of action will happen later on in the stage of that acquisition. And quite honestly, I think it will happen later in terms of early spring to summer. But nevertheless, I think it will happen, just to underscore, look, what are you all going to do for natural gas supplies next winter? They're not going to be able to recover. There's not enough underground natural gas storage to recover. We could continue to max out deliveries. And I say we, the free market is maxing out deliveries to Europe because European utilities are outbidding any kind of Asian bids for waterborne transport of LNG shipments. So I just think that in his mind, Robert, Putin has played this out for 20 years. And the fact that there's a 40-mile chain of tanks and armor stalled, I think that's part of the plan. That's not necessarily something that is unexpected on his part. I mean, I think people need to understand this isn't the first country that he's attacked. I think people need to look back and think about Aleppo and Grozny and his willingness to attack those cities and kill those many civilians is just an affirmation of what I think he's going to do here in Ukraine. And again, one of his top level weapons is energy. We cannot supplant what he supplies with all the national concerted efforts we might have by building LNG facilities in Europe. We just can't do that. It won't happen for 3.5 years.
There's just not enough. There's just not enough molecules.
No. And so Europe is going to be in the position of rationing natural gas. Now, you and I a few weeks ago talked about the impact on fertilizer and food. Again, one of our biggest clients turns natural gas into ammonia and then into ammonia-based fertilizer downstream after that. There's not going to be enough fertilizer for Europe for the crops this spring and summer. You're going to see food shortages throughout. I understand that 15% of the wheat in the world and 13% of the corn in the world moves through Ukraine, through the Baltic Sea. And so the reverberations of what's going on right now, as they stem from the power of natural gas or the lack of power when you don't have it, I think it's going to impact the world for the next 2 to 3 years.
And there's no avoiding it.
No, and that's part of the whole plan. That's part of the 20-year march. I mean, think about it. You and I both know how much money was spent on the disinformation campaign in Europe by Putin, by Gazprom. It's been verified by the Center for European Studies.
And how much? I don't know. How much was that? Do you have that number?
$95 million. Now,
so $95 million that the Russians used
on disinformation campaign on hydraulic fracturing.
So to funnel to NGOs in Europe so that European countries would pass bans on hydraulic fracturing.
And they were successful. And when you think about it, they could have spent 10 times that number and it would have been payout for them. In turn, they could have spent $1 billion on that. I mean, in essence, think about it from this standpoint. 15 years ago, the production in the EU, the natural gas production in the EU, was greater than the imports coming from Russia. But in the last 15 years, and I think in large part to this $95 million, and I got to say, other people would tell you they've spent 10 times that number, but this is a number that they're comfortable reporting.
Right.
RT News, Russian television news, had advertisements comparing frackers to pedophiles. I mean, that's how ridiculous this thing got. But 7 large countries bought off on it. Some of the biggest countries in Europe. I mean, we've got France, Germany, the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Italy, Ireland, UK. I said Italy. They did not. UK and Spain all put in hydraulic fracturing bans when they could be as self-sufficient on natural gas had they pursued hydraulic fracturing and the development of their shale plays. They could be as self-sufficient and energy independent as the United States is now.
And did you do a sum? I think just before we started recording, that you you'd added up the population of all those countries, France, Germany. We're talking hundreds.
I was just actually in the process of doing it, but I mean, they cherry picked and
the biggest economies in Europe.
The biggest economies in Europe. I mean, all you really had to do was attack Germany and France. From a technical standpoint, some of the Eastern European countries are the countries where there are shale formations, and they picked those off in terms of Bulgaria. So this was a very high level, you call it what you want, chess game planned out for 20 years, where in addition to doing this, they were simultaneously making sure that they owned all of the large natural gas fields in Russia. And if I can, I'll give you a couple of examples. So the Kovitka field near Irkutsk, Siberia, I think it was in 2007 or 2008, the Russia's Natural Environment Inspectorate, the Rosprirod Nadzor, went to Irkutsk, Siberia, BP was managing what we think is one of the largest natural gas fields in the world. British Petroleum was. And this environmental inspectorate announced to BP, we're going to meet with you. And we have the same issues on how you're spoiling the environment. We may pull your license. Well, BP owned this with some Russian oligarchs. And for the prior 3 years, Gazprom, the big pipeline production company, refused to give them access to their pipelines. So in essence, even if they produced, they had nowhere to take the natural gas.
So it was all stranded.
Right. So the next step was to employ the same methods that they employed with Shell at Sakhalin, the offshore LNG facility, the largest one in the world. They went into Shell. They said, hey, we don't like your track record. We want to operate. Months later, with Sakhalin, Shell was no longer the operator. Gazprom was the operator, 51%. It's reported that Shell could have lost as much as $1 to $2 billion. 5 days ago, Shell walked away from their ownership in that facility. So fast forward a couple years later, they go to Irkutsk, Siberia. They meet with BP's country manager in Irkutsk, a man named Enver Zaganshin. Enver Zaganshin must have upset them because after the Wednesday meeting with these people from the environmental inspectorate, he went out to his sauna in Irkutsk, Siberia. I mean, you're talking about in the middle of nowhere. His wife went outside an hour later trying to find out where he was, and he was murdered. Shot once in the forehead, twice in the chest. One of the other BP managers at the time said, well, I guess that's our message to get out of Russia. Soon after that, they took over that license, and then they committed that field through a pipeline to China in what was estimated to be a $400 billion deal over 30 years.
And that's the power of Siberia pipeline.
That's it.
Right.
And
A
so
30 year supply contract for Russian gas into China. That now they just announced or just began the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, right? So
correct,
this is
correct.
Well, so I've thought about this a lot myself, and I've thought, I've been a little too busy to write it myself, but I'll put the question to you. So is the world now defined in terms of gas politics? Is the world defined by gas pipelines today?
Apparently not in the United States. If I can, I'll jump into another story.
No, sure, go ahead.
That, buddy, it's killing the lead here in a sense. So on February 11th, the European Union Minister for Energy comes to the U.S., comes to Washington, D.C. for the 9th annual EU-U.S. Energy Council. And she profusely thanks the U.S. for the lifeline that is LNG imports to Europe from the United States. Again, all free market. It's not being dictated by the United States, but with our wealth of natural gas, we have a lot to export. We're exporting, I think, 12 billion cubic feet of gas per day. So back up a little bit, a good friend at a construction company told me that a number of the existing LNG plants, export facilities in the U.S., had decided 3 months ago, even long before the Ukraine issue, that they wanted to add another train to their facilities. And so they were
adding another train, another liquefaction train to expand their ability to export LNG. Right.
It was obvious. I mean, the spread was one of those, oh my gosh, we have the gas, we have the spread and the money, let's get this done.
And sorry, just so people who don't know the spread, so you're talking about the spread between the price of gas at, say, Henry Hub, which is the most common marker in the U.S., and the selling price or the offer price for that same gas in Europe. So that spread, the differential between those two prices.
Yes, to give you that spread, this morning, the 5-year price for natural gas at Henry Hub was trading at roughly $3.73. So the 5-year forward look for the price at Henry Hub is at $3.73. By good estimates, based on what we anticipate will happen to the Ukrainian gas pipelines, we fully expect that the price for natural gas in Europe for the next 3 to 5 years will be over $20. You can transport a lot of natural gas when you have a spread from $3.50 to $20. And so it was very, very obvious to all of these exporters. They said, we've got to put in our FID, our final investment decision on these facilities So they've submitted permits. All of those permits are on hold right now at the Department of Energy for further inspection. There are northeastern U.S. senators who live in states that have pretty much blocked any pipeline access to that part of the country. They're saying, oh, no, 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 we don't want to export natural gas. But the thing that has me most upset right now is that the government agency that oversees the policies and the permit approvals for natural gas pipelines, for interstate natural gas pipelines across state to state, is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The current commission chairman, Robert Glick, was elevated to the chairmanship by Mr. Biden, by President Biden. Robert, 5 days after the EU's minister came to Washington, D.C., thanked us for all the LNG, 5 days after that, Glick announces 2 new directives for the policy of permitting or of reviewing permits for natural gas pipelines. And 2 of those directives that are landmark kind of decisions. These are huge issues. No change has been made to this FERC policy since 1999, so it's been 23 years. But 2 of those issues that had to be considered going forward before you build it or permit a natural gas pipeline in the U.S. are climate change issues. And you've got to discuss things with the climate change lobby. Neither of those.
So as Russia is teeing up now, this is a couple of weeks back now. You know, we're in early March, but as Russia is teeing up their assault on on Ukraine, the Biden administration is restraining the growth of gas exports potentially to Europe via LNG.
Yes, they are. Which is counterintuitive. I mean, we have a shale play in Western Colorado. And it's not just the Biden administrations, it's California, Oregon, Washington. It's the state of Colorado under our Democratic leaders right now. But so they instituted new rules in Colorado 3 years ago. Our oil production has dropped off 30%. In parts of the Front Range, you can't drill a well within 2,000 feet of any structure, which eliminated probably 70 to 80% of the drillable locations in Weld County, Colorado. In Western Colorado, we have a shale basin that's world class, on par, I would say, with Kovitka Field or Sahalin. It's the Mancos Shale that's only second to the Marcellus Shale in the U.S. So think Marcellus Shale, 2006, virtually no production. 2017, 18, 26 BCF a day of the Marcellus Shale. This Mancos Shale in Western Colorado, Robert, with the proper incentives, which we have in terms of price, with the elimination of regulations and blocking mechanisms by different states, we could be exporting to world-class markets, a world-class resource in Western Colorado. We could be exporting anywhere, from my producer estimates in Western Colorado, anywhere from 12 to 15 BCF a day, which would meet Europe's demand. So I just don't understand why the climate change argument is more important than supporting Europe these days. But that's the bottom line.
Well, let me interrupt you there, because it seems like, what is clear is that, I mean, Germany has done a very quick about face, right? They're saying, oh, wait, we didn't mean to close those nuclear plants. We're going to reopen the ones that they just closed in the end of December. And that there seems to be a sudden, clarifying of the mind in Europe around energy policy, but you're saying that still the Biden administration is not even recognizing what's going on. I mean,
they don't.
I know you're a conservative. I know you're a Republican, but this is about the permits and regulations around critical energy production at a time when Ukraine and Europe have been left vulnerable because of Russia's energy power play, right? Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, one of the German ministers said pragmatism must trump every political commitment. I don't think that our leaders in this country right now recognize that Russia is at our doorstep as much as they are at Germany's doorstep. I think that a lot of them are trying to explain away Putin's behavior right now as being some COVID fog, which is ridiculous. They don't look at the history of what he's been doing for 20 years to get to this point. I don't think the Ukraine is the last country that he's going to go after. I think I think, Robert, in 1991, when the Soviet Union failed, there were 15 or 16 NATO countries. I think every one of those former Soviet Union countries that joined NATO was a knife in the side or in the back of Vladimir Putin. At least that's how he saw it. And
And
he's
now,
not.
it's payback time.
It's payback time, and I've got you on the energy. I've got you by the energy.
Short hairs, I think, is
I wanted to say that, but I'll let
the
you
technical.
say it.
We're on a podcast. I think we can say short hairs if we like to say short
Yeah,
hairs. We can even
that's
say
my
long
house.
hairs. Not that either of us know much about long hairs, but they're nevertheless.
No, but we
Um,
don't. I don't think we understand or deeply understand. At least the far left doesn't understand that this has been 20 years in the making. This is not some recent delusion. He had a very careful, consolidate ownership, block other production, you know, uh, persuade people that hydraulic fracturing across the world is a bad thing. And I don't think the money that he invested in the anti-fracking campaign in Europe stopped in Europe. I'm convinced that many of the NGOs that opposed hydraulic fracturing here in the U.S. had funds from Russia. But again, that might smack too much for some people of a conspiracy theory. But let me put it this way: if I was Putin, I would have done it, because every MMBTU or every 1,000 cubic feet of gas that doesn't wind up in Europe is that much less competition for my gas.
Well, so let's talk about storage for a minute, because as memory serves, I mean, the U.S. has remarkable geology, right? It's a very big country. We have the excellent shale rock, but we also have other rock that from depleted oil and gas fields that is really good for gas storage. But if memory serves, Europe's geology, their gas storage capabilities are a small fraction of what we have in the U.S. Is that right?
Well, one of the other benefits that we have, that's correct, yes. One of the other benefits we have, though, is the number of wells that have penetrated formations across the country, is that we have probably a better idea of what's going on underground in terms of underground formations than any other country in the world. Imagine China. I would guess that China has half of 1% of the total drilled locations by per capita per geography that we do. And so they really just don't know what's going on underground. Now, there's plenty of gas storage in Europe in terms of available depleted oil formations. But if you're moving to a world without methane, why would you ever build utility located storage or production area storage? You wouldn't do it. It's funny, here in the US, there was no real spread between winter and summer for many years because we had so much flowing gas from the shale revolution that the amount of natural gas storage that we developed here in the US was not what it was years before. I've been involved in a lot of natural gas storage projects, but even if Europe had 5 times the number of gas storage fields that they do right now, it's still a question of, can you get the gas there even off season for the needs that you have in the winter heating season? So
they just don't have the. I think of that gas in storage as a battery, right? I mean, it is a
yes.
stored ability to store that and call on it and when you need it and turn it into electrons. But let's jump back then to the when I talked to. I don't know if you saw that the former head of MI6, a guy named Dearlove in Britain, just recently said that the British government needs to suspend all of their anti-fracking regulations and get drilling immediately. So you have a lot of experience in this business. Well, so here's the UK effectively at zero in terms of shale gas. If Boris Johnson and the Parliament said, okay, forget all that stuff. We were drunk then. We're sober now. We wanted to start drilling immediately. How soon between the time they say go and getting rigs in place, getting roughnecks and tool pushers and all the electricians and all the people that man the rig, the frac spread, all the rest of that, get the pipelines? How long will it take between the time they say go and the time they start delivering methane into the British or European markets?
Now I've got an answer for that, but I want to take you through a story. So I'm in China in 2008 teaching PetroChina employees, 200 of them, about 20 Central Party committee members about natural gas. And the country manager for EOG, the old Enron Oil and Gas Resources, they had a concession in Southwest China. We were at dinner at one of these state dinners, and I asked him, I said, I understand you're going to be fracking a well. Now, up until that point in time, they had only fracked about 60 wells in China. And I said to him, I said, how's that coming? He goes, oh, John, you got to realize we have every hydraulic fracture truck in Asia right now on that location, which stunned me because I measure now, after that comment and what I'm about to tell you, I measure energy independence as how many crews do you have out there that can go out and frack a well. So I came back to the U.S. A good friend of mine was number 2 at Halliburton, Jim Brown. I said, Jimmy, how many wells could we frack on any given day in the U.S. and North America? I called a friend at Schlumberger also, and they both came back with, on any given day, unlike China, where every frack truck in Asia was on location, back then in 2008, 9, and 10, we could frack as many as 400 to 500 wells on any given day. Now, given what's transpired over the last 10 years, I doubt that number's there. But what you got to think about is that, we were joking the other night, where have all the truck drivers gone? I said, well, all the C-class truck drivers got all the rental cars and must have driven in Newfoundland. We can't get rental cars or C-class drivers now. To answer that question, you've got to assume how quickly could we build up the knowledge base and the fleet of people with that knowledge to activate the kind of facilities and response time that we have here in the U.S. When even here in the U.S., it's tough to find a C-class driver. To answer your question, I would guess it would take at least 5 years. But that's how long for EU. If EU just went in and said, okay, we're done, we want to be energy independent, it would take them at least 5 years to supplant what Putin supplies via pipeline.
Okay, so fair enough, but I'll reiterate just that so you're giving the big picture question about supplanting all Russian gas. What I'm just curious, given what you've said, and I take your point. We have a labor shortage in the United States.
Yes.
I travel all across the country. I talk to people, and they're saying, I was at an electricity conference in Denver, in fact, when I saw you last, and I was talking to a guy about some project, and he said, yeah, well, we get projects all the time, but we don't have the people to work them. And right. I've heard the same from people in the drilling sector, in the upstream sector, saying we just don't have enough people. So, but if again, to first gas, so if Quadrilla or one of the companies that has concessions in the UK or did have concessions in shale gas in the UK, if they said go, how long before they get one of the rigs from the U.S. and get a frac spread over there with all the Roughnecks tool pushers, the people that can drill and complete that well and connect it to the pipeline network? How many months would it take if they said go and we had a spare rig and enough people? How long would it take them before they could get first gas flowing?
I'm not an expert in terms of the ability to find those people in that country. There, for all I know, there could be, 3 rig crews sitting down in Bulgaria that could move right up. But I would be surprised if it happened if the first flow of gas happened within 9 months.
Uh-huh. So you're and
then it's the scalability of it. It's the scalability of it after that. How do you, we've got a client right now that's going to resurrect a rig in Western Colorado. And one of the CFOs has been traveling across 3 different states trying to decide what rig to get. And since we're on a podcast, he said, John, I found a rig, but the crew is for shit. That's the problem, is that, you want a crew that's been working together for years, that's very, very, very efficient. And I'm afraid that it's going to take some time to develop that for Europe.
So it's not enough, right? So it will, as I put it, it's about rigs, rednecks, and rights, right? And I say rednecks.
You've said that before. That's a great one. Yeah.
With all due respect, these are my people. I'm from Oklahoma. I know from rednecks, but you can have the best AC top drive rig. You can have all the best equipment, all the best material, but you have to have the highly trained, skilled workers in order to make all that happen. if Europe wants to make it happen, those guys are going to have to come from Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, the Marcellus. These are going to be American guys, would be the best ones to do that. But we don't have those extra roustabouts, do we? I mean, from what
we
you're
don't,
telling me.
and I mean, I think maybe a great or a barometer for that is, I hear people say that we're short 70,000 to 90,000 welders in the country. We've lived through a time period where there weren't very many parents that wanted to send their kid to a Votech school to learn how to weld,
right?
Which I think is shameful. An average really good welder now can make $120,000 to $150,000 a year.
Wow.
And they start in that position without having any college debt for the most part. But I think we've lost our way in terms of understanding how rewarding that kind of life can be. I mean, a welder can live anywhere he wants to now in the U.S. He can start up his own crew, develop his own crew. In fact, they call them tribal crews almost for welders. But I think when you talk about the shortage, it's very, very serious in the C-class driver area, any kind of truck drivers and welders. And so I think that extends.
And they have to be able to pass a drug test. And that's one of the other key hurdles as well, right? That they've got to pee in a bottle and that they've got to be able to pass the drug test in addition to having the right capability, the right attitude, the right desire to work, the rest of it.
There was a company, I'll just share a story with you about drug tests. The guy goes in, mandatory drug test whenever they wanted to. He turns his sample in. The supervisor calls him in and says, now look, I'm just going to tell you this. You have to quit today and say you're not going to turn in your sample and come back in 2 weeks. Because if you turn in that sample the way that it is right now, I can't hire you for 90 days. That's how desperate that company was to make sure that individual person wasn't taken off the cycle of being rehired for 90 days. Think about it. Think about how desperate that employer is then to look around the regulations from their own company just to make sure that they've got somebody for their need.
Well, the other thing that pops into my head was I was in Little Rock in October. I spoke to the Arkansas Independent Royalty Owners Association, and I know Randy Zook, who's the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Arkansas. He came to the meeting, and if memory serves, he told me J.B. Hunt, which is a big trucking company based in Arkansas, what were they short 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 drivers? They said they would hire them right then, but they were short thousands of drivers, commercial drivers. So
waste management right now, waste management will put your kids and your grandkids pay the full college scholarship if you sign on to drive for them.
Well, I have kids. I don't
really?
have grandkids, but I'm starting to
kids
be in the
and
wrong.
Grandkids. And I got this from an executive at Waste Management.
Wow.
Think about that.
That's remarkable. Well, so cast this forward, John. So now we've talked about where Russia is relative to Ukraine now. We've talked about even if they bring in rigs and start deploying them now, and assuming again that we have the labor, that they can get the water, the sand, all of the other things that they need that generate the generation sets, all the other things that they're going to need to operate a modern, efficient drilling rig, AC top drive, whatever it is. What does this look like in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in terms of gas prices, in nat gas prices in Europe, and what effect does that have in the U.S. in particular? Does the U.S. nat gas price rise as more global demand happens and more LNG gets exported? How does that differential, the spread that you talked about, how does that work out over the next couple of years?
You and I have talked recently about internal rate of return and the efficiency
for companies that are drilling
yes.
new rigs, yeah.
The efficiency of the U.S. gas producer you can't compare that to anyone else in the world. And so we're able to produce gas, or what I've called in the past a widget, smarter, faster, cheaper, better, to steal something from one of your old book titles, probably more so than any other country in the world. I mean, we only account for, Robert, I think it's the U.S. accounts for 6% of the total reserves in the world for natural gas, but 23% of the current production. And so when you hear that magic word, U.S. gas reserves, my question is, at what price did you calculate that reserve price?
Mm-hmm.
Because I look at natural gas visually almost like, well, I've got this much natural gas on the $3 shelf, this much natural gas on the $5 shelf, and I've got more gas than the world could ever use at $10 shelf. Well, here we are at $20 in Europe for the next 3 years.
Right.
You're going to have a situation where
And $20 in 3 years and $50 today.
50 immediately, $60 on December 22nd. We have unlimited resources for what they need. We have an efficiency that's higher than any other country. We have an internal rate of return. I mean, it chills me that the Biden administration doesn't understand that the EU is on a war footing here. And we should at very least be looking at the moral equivalent of the Lend-Lease Act. Thank you, Mr. President Roosevelt, where we're doing everything that we can to increase the reserves that we have available to export. Here's the other thing that we could do also is that when you talk about
that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but so maybe to rephrase it, a natural gas Lend-Lease, a natural
Absolutely.
gas, that the U.S. should launch a natural gas Lend-Lease for Europe.
And what we should do also is that because you're talking about on a liquefaction facility to receive that gas in Europe, you know, it's a fairy tale to think that some countries could actually afford to build their own LNG facility, finance import facilities, and give them a special loan rate if they use U.S. natural gas. Finance it all downstream. I mean, this commitment by Germany in the last 10 days to 2 new LNG plants, Robert, that's probably about a $10 billion commitment. Germany can do that. Do you think Estonia can? They can't. Think Bulgaria can?
Well, it's interesting that you say that when you bring up the idea of U.S. financing for this, because under the Obama administration, and I don't know whether it's under the Biden administration as well, but some of the key bilateral lending entities in the U.S., one of them is the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which now I think has been renamed, and International Finance Corporation. Anyway, they changed names, but they prohibited OPIC at that time from financing coal plants in Vietnam. And some of the other things that World Bank has done and the multilateral lenders have done is to prohibit any lending or political risk insurance or other these parts of the financing packages for hydrocarbon projects anywhere in the world. So it seems like this as Benny Pizer talked about it, this sobering up around energy policy still hasn't happened in the United States. The Europeans seem like they're waking up from a very bad hangover and they're getting sober right darn quick, but I don't sense that in the United States.
Imagine going today to the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and saying, you know, we can align ourselves with China and we can deliver natural gas to China cheaper than it's coming out of Kovitka Field in Irkut, Siberia, Russia to China. And we can bring China in a form of what I call LNG diplomacy. And we can commit reserves in Western Colorado to the tune where we could literally be delivering 5 BCF a day to China or to the worldwide LNG market. Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, for the greater good of the world, will you please allow us to put a pipeline under that river to get to that LNG export facility? And Robert, they would still today, and their equivalent agencies in California and Washington would all say no.
Because climate change trumps everything.
Climate change trumps everything, but they seem to not understand that for every MMBTU of natural gas that China burns, instead of coal, you cut carbon emissions by 50%. And so there's not my backyard mentality, and then to simultaneously be concerned about climate change and 2 degrees of temperature change 50 years out is incongruous, and that's a nice word for it. It doesn't add up to me. And then now layer in the security. The phrase I've coined is energy relativism, where you have people at cocktail parties saying, well, I'm for all of the above. Well, any German that was saying that 3 months ago how much are they for Russian natural gas today in their energy relativistic world? They're not. How long before the same thinking that the Germans held a month ago is dispelled here in the U.S.? What is it going to take for us to realize that the culmination of this story with Putin is the standoff that's going to occur when he attacks a NATO country, and he is hands down threatening nuclear war. That's the final part of the chess game with Putin, is the free world willing to go to a conflated nuclear war with Russia to protect Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia? His bet right now, based on the response in Ukraine, is they won't do it. And yet, we're leaving this COVID, 2-year. Oh, I'm so sick and tired of that. What I'm trying to tell people is that we're facing this threat from Putin, I think, for at least another 10 years. This is not hey, there's a sweet, clean diplomatic exit for what's happened in Ukraine. What's happened here is no different than what happened in Syria, Georgia, and in a frame, Belarus. And this is just the slow march to reinvigorate and relive the Soviet idealism that he holds so dear.
So the only, I'll ask this question. So is the only way out of this to drill, baby, drill? Is that the solution here?
In Europe, in the United States, and to build liquefaction and regasification facilities in Europe.
So you're saying yes, there's no alternative but to drill.
Absolutely.
And what do you say to the people who are, there's been, CNN ran a piece the other day, and I've seen these other ones. Oh, well, this just proves we don't need hydrocarbons and we need to embrace renewables. What do you say to those people?
They're living in la la land. I mean, we both know that renewable energy is not dispatchable, nor can you really store it on a utility scale. One of my favorite quotes is stolen from our friend Alex Epstein, that you could have 500 years of Tesla battery factory production, and that would only hold 1 day of utility or of the electricity volume of the U.S. So this notion that we can flip a switch and move to renewable energy has been perpetrated by campaigners that have convinced policymakers and politicians, and then those campaigners don't have to live with the mess that they created later on, and nobody knows that mess better than what happened in ERCOT 13 months ago.
Yeah.
It just, guys, you can't be energy relativistic. You've got to look at the likelihood that natural gas is going to come in from Russia. And oh my God, how did you miss the historical premise that between 1991 and 2005 he interrupted it 55 times? How did you allow yourself to get hooked on that crack natural gas pipeline? But now, again, to your point, the Germans have woken up. What's it going to take for the Democratic Party in the U.S. to wake up? And I don't qualify that. I mean, I qualify the Democratic Party in the U.S. But how much hardship has to play out in Europe, and how much hardship has to play out in low-income energy households here in the U.S., where their natural gas costs are going to be priced out from what they can afford? All of those homes spend a disproportionate amount of their income on heating, and many homes are trying to choose between heating and eating. That's why we have the low-income energy assistance program nationwide. But I don't see a lot of low-income households clamoring over climate change issues. And I see 1 million people leaving Ukraine right now because, in essence, this all started with allowing Putin to use natural gas as a geopolitical weapon. It's like, would you all please wake up to the reality of what's going on here?
So it's a pretty bleak assessment, John. I mean, and
I agree. I hope and pray I'm wrong. But Robert, I've been watching this going up. Look what he did now. Look how he shut down Sakhalin, took it over. Look how he shut down Kovitka. Look how he played this game with, claiming that frackers are pedophiles. Look how successful he was with 7 countries in the European Union signed on to a fracking ban. Look at how he somehow persuaded, or that cause persuaded people in the U.S. to be afraid of hydraulic fracturing. When honestly, the combination of fracking and horizontal drilling was the greatest breakthrough since we split the atom. But it presented the biggest threat to his 25-year campaign to reunite the Soviet Union.
So, in spite of all this, John, I always in my episodes, my podcasts, asking people what makes them, what gives them hope. And I've had to change it a little bit because a recent guest, Simon Irish, CEO of Terrestrial Energy, he kind of laughed when I asked him that. And I said, why? He said, well, I used to be on Wall Street. And on Wall Street, we said there are 2 kinds of hope, Bob Hope and no hope. He said, I'm optimistic. He said, hope is something different. So amidst all of this, what makes you optimistic or hopeful?
The Germans get it. The Germans finally get it.
That they're the key in all of this.
And one of the things that I think forced them to get it were the 500,000 people that went into the streets and protested a week ago. It was really 500,000. There are analysts that really think that that's what pushed their Olaf, the head of Germany, into this. Oh my God! But that one quote, Robert: "Pragmatism must trump every political commitment." That came from Germany. That quote in the last 2 days. Their willingness to recognize that they cannot be too reliant on renewable energy. They've got to re-engage hydrocarbons, and they shouldn't be retiring those nuclear plants. I mean, buddy, I'm a gas guy, but we should be building every nuclear plant we can get our hands on these days. That's security. We should be engaging every shale basin in the U.S. and promoting some effort to double the amount of natural gas that we export within 5 years. And I'll just tell you right now, there were times when LNG terminals came online down in the Gulf Coast, and the natural gas price actually dropped. The Haynesville, the Haynesville Shale, those people will benefit because of their geographic proximity to so many of the export facilities. But I just note, there aren't a whole lot of natural gas pipelines up in the Northeast because they've been opposed to those. And there's not one liquefied natural gas export facility along the West Coast. I'd love to see a national effort to change that, to recognize.
So we need a national strategy.
Absolutely. For both internal use and, let's put it this way. I would rather send 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas to Europe than bullets and missiles. And so I call it LNG diplomacy. And we really need to look harder at this world of energy relativism. And apparently Germany has woken up. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in this midterm election, because I think there's a great awakening going on right now also. We'll see. I'm hopeful.
Bob Hope and no hope.
And Harpole's hope. So.
Well, John, we've talked for about an hour. I don't want to keep you. And my guest and my friend, proud to call him my friend, John Harpole. He's the president of Mercator Energy. You can find out more about him at mercatorenergy.com. John, many thanks for being on the Power Hungry podcast. Again, the paycheck for this one is the same as the last one.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Be well. Take care.
And thanks to all you in podcast land. Tune in to for the next episode of Power Hungry Podcast. We might do I'm sure we're going to do some more on Ukraine, but there's a lot to talk about. So until
and just
next
finally, pray for those people in Ukraine.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Thanks again, John. And thanks to all of you again. Until next time.